es bei Tag den Blumen erzählt, ich liebe dich. Ich habe es bei Nacht den Sternen erzählt, ich liebe dich.
Welcome to the 16th episode of Always Remember, World War II Through Veterans' Eyes. Liberators of the Holocaust, Part 2. Dachau Concentration Camp. Adolf Hitler's final solution was carried out in at least 44,000 concentration camps, ghettos, and forced labor camps spread out throughout Europe. An estimated 15 to 20 million people were murdered in these camps, including 6 million Jews. For the young American GIs who liberated them, the horrors of the Nazi concentration camps far outweighed anything they had experienced in war. When Barney Zylka broke into Dachau, its crematoriums were still burning, with hands and feet sticking out of them. Zylka wished he could see a Nazi so he could empty his rifle into the Nazi's belly. Karl Mann recalled how American GIs, angered by the pathetic condition of Dachau's prisoners and the bodies stacked around the camp like firewood, lined up dozens of concentration camp guards against a wall and for a few seconds mowed them down with a machine gun until the battalion commander stopped them. Standing guard at Dachau, the liberated inmates seemed more like skeletons than men to Jim Dorris. The horrors he saw at Dachau made Dorris think he must be in hell. Dorris prayed, and a concentration camp prisoner soon answered his prayer by making Dorris realize that goodness could still be found even at Dachau. Just outside Dachau, Dee Eberhart passed the death train, filled with some 4,480 prisoners from Buchenwald, packed 80 men to a car. All but one of the death train's occupants had perished from exposure, disease, starvation, and SS bullets. Local townspeople claimed total ignorance of the camp, but GIs like David Israel didn't believe them for a minute, as during the day many of Dachau's prisoners were marched around town and forced to work in local industries, while Dachau's cruel prison guards boasted about their work at night in local bars. In the first few weeks following the camp's liberation, Edward S. Weiss recalled how deaths at the rate of 20 to 30 men per day still occurred, the prisoners so weakened by disease and malnutrition. These stories and more in this, the 16th episode of Always Remember World War II Through Veterans' Eyes. I consider these episodes on the Liberators of the Holocaust to be the most important in the series. During the 1990s, while serving as a teacher with the Department of Defense schools in Bad Kreuznach, Germany, my family and I visited many of the sites associated with World War II, from the beaches of Normandy, where the D-Day landings took place, to the Ardennes forest, where the Battle of the Bulge was fought, to the death camps of Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and Dachau. We saw what was at stake in World War II, when not only democracy in the United States, but throughout the world, hung in the balance. I began to write to World War II veterans to thank them for their service. I sent them pictures of the sites that we visited. I invited them to share their stories with me, and I promised to keep them alive in the classes that I taught. What I never could have anticipated was that veterans shared their stories with their buddies and printed my letters in the reunion newsletters. I was soon corresponding with approximately 140 World War II veterans, 20 of whom received the nation's highest honor, the Medal of Honor. I had more material than I could ever use in the classes I taught. So to keep my promise, I wrote Always Remember World War II Through Veterans' Eyes and launched this series of podcasts, which are based upon the book. Opened in 1933, Dachau was the first of the Nazi concentration camps. Some 238,000 people were imprisoned at the camp, which covered an area of about 60 football fields. During its peak, Dachau had 240 subcamps under its jurisdiction. Only Dachau itself, and not its subcamps, had the infamous gas chambers and ovens. As with the rest of the Nazi concentration camps, prisoners primarily consisted of Jews, Catholics, Romani gypsies, political prisoners, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and some captured enemy soldiers. Almost 3,000 Catholic priests were sent to Dachau, with some 1,270 still alive at its liberation. Unlike Buchenwald, the American High Command knew about the existence of Dachau and the horrors that were taking place there. Paul Levy, a Belgian foreign correspondent, had been a prisoner at Dachau. Levy later traveled with Brigadier General Henning Linden's party and the 42nd Infantry Division, along with journalists Marguerite Higgins of the New York Herald and Peter First of Stars and Stripes. Levy informed General Linden of the existence of Dachau and urged him to liberate the camp as soon as possible. Unlike the other concentration camps liberated by Americans, Nazi guards did not abandon their posts and fired from the guard towers at the Americans as they arrived to liberate the camp. Bernard Barney Zylka of Duluth, Minnesota, had been a tank driver, a gunner, and a driver for General Patton's aid in Africa and Sicily before he participated in the liberation of Dachau. "We had a tank knock down the iron fence at Dachau, and we went in with rifles ready, because there were crowds dressed like prisoners, and they were taking shots at us. I never did see any snipers, but as I was looking at the thousands of 60-pound skeletons lying on their bunks piled over each other 6 or 7 layers high, I was wishing and crying at the same time that I would see a Kraut and empty my rifle into his belly." Zylka had been in the invasion of Sicily. At St. Tropez, a German sniper put a bullet 6 inches from my head and splattered bark in my face, but we captured him. He had crossed the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen just before it caved into the Rhine, killing 28 and injuring another 63 men. He had spent the Christmas of 1944 in Bastogne, fighting the Battle of the Bulge, recalling, "We never sang too many Christmas carols then." But nothing he had experienced before prepared him for the senseless horror that he found at Dachau. "When me and the sergeant broke into Dachau, the ovens were still burning, and heads and feet were still sticking out of them. I cried like a little kid, and I threw up there. Even dead soldiers didn't bother me, but those concentration camps, I'll never forget them." As with Buchenwald, which had been liberated only days before, the Americans forced local Germans to see for themselves the atrocities that had occurred there. Zylka wrote, "Yes, we made the German people come and see all the dead corpses lying around. They didn't even know what was going on." Still, Zylka questioned how the German civilians could plead ignorance to the atrocities. He had smelled the burning bodies at Dachau from 20 miles before arriving at the camp. His lieutenant told Zylka to check out one of the bunkhouses and to be on guard for any German snipers hiding amongst the prisoners. Zylka entered a bunkhouse alone and found hundreds of bodies all lined up, all stacked in the bunks, not quite dead, but not quite alive either. The emaciated prisoners had not yet realized they were being liberated. "A 60-pound guy came walking towards me, shaking, trying to say something. We were told not to touch them," Zylka recalled. It was feared that the prisoners carried disease. Still, the prisoner came towards Zylka. "I thought, how am I going to get away from this guy? I pretended one of my buddies was over there calling out to me. I said, 'Okay, I'll be right over there.' I started crying. I had to leave that guy. He had just stood there looking at me." As with so many of the GIs that liberated the concentration camps, Zylka wanted to make sure Americans never forgot the atrocities the Nazis committed there. Zylka implored me, "Don't let your family or anyone forget all these atrocities. Teach them. Tell them what I told you here. I hate when people say this never happened. Believe me, it did. It was real." Karl Mann of Yardley, Pennsylvania, remembered the reaction of Dachau's prisoners upon learning that the Americans had arrived to liberate them. "They shouted with joy," Mann wrote. "The roar was tremendous and could be heard quite a distance from the compound." When the American soldiers saw the pathetic condition of Dachau's prisoners and the bodies stacked around the camp like firewood, they reacted with anger, directed against the concentration camp guards. Mann recalled it took a battalion commander to gain control of them. On the day the camp was liberated, angry American soldiers from our battalion lined up dozens against a wall and for a few seconds mowed them down with a machine gun or a bar until the battalion commander stopped them. As a barman with Company A, 222nd Regiment of the Rainbow Infantry Division, Jim Dorris of Chattanooga, Tennessee, had already seen plenty of brutality committed by both sides before liberating Dachau. As a strong Catholic, he objected to cruelty regardless of whose side caused it. Dorris had been sickened by the behavior of his fellow GIs when on Christmas Eve, after a long journey standing in the back of open trucks, several soldiers from his platoon decided to warm themselves by setting fire to a nearby home. In his autobiography, Dorris could hardly hold back his disgust. As we drove away, I watched the family struggling to contain the flames that were engulfing their home. It was hopeless. It sickened me to think of those poor people, now with no house and no clothes, everything gone. And this was Christmas Day. Dorris was haunted by the memory of a little girl, no more than 4 or 5 years old, whose screams of "Papa, Papa," he could not get out of his head. His platoon had come across a group of houses and had decided to look for eggs and bread to supplement their rations. 2 American sergeants dragged the little girl's father out into the street and shot him in the head, right in front of his screaming daughter. The man collapsed backwards, and when he hit the ground, the whole top of his skull came off with his brain still in it. It was a cold morning, and steam was rising from his brains into the frigid air. When Dorris confronted the 2 sergeants as to why they had shot the man, one of them claimed they had seen an SS tattoo on his arm, and that was all it took. As the platoon marched on, the little girl stood sobbing by her mutilated father, her arms waving into the air. Dorris wrote, "It seemed like we would never get beyond the sound of her screams." 50 years later, Dorris still prayed for the little girl. Dorris had indeed seen plenty of cruelty before he arrived at Dachau concentration camp to liberate it, but nothing could prepare him for the hell he found there. In a letter he sent to a German teacher and copied for me, Dorris recalled the smell of Dachau. "Blocks before we reached the camp was the terrible odor of burned bodies given off by the crematorium. It made me feel as if I couldn't get my breath." As he approached Dachau, Dorris passed a train that was stopped on the tracks about 500 meters from the camp itself. The train's seemingly endless line of boxcars was filled with hideous cargo. "Upon arrival at the camp, we saw a train of 40 boxcars loaded with bodies of prisoners who had been sent from other camps to Dachau. I'll never forget the sight of bodies lying on top of each other and spilled out onto the ground when guards had opened the doors to machine gun anyone who was still left alive. Most of them had died from starvation on the long trip without food and water. Later, some of our men searching the cars had found one man still alive." An estimated 1,500 corpses filled Dachau's train of death. The train had originated in Buchenwald. As the Allies approached, 29,000 of Buchenwald's prisoners were forced into what became a death march. By April 7, 1945, the Americans were so close to Buchenwald their artillery fire could be heard from the camp. 4,480 of Buchenwald's prisoners, many of them recently located from Dora concentration camp, were squeezed into boxcars, 80 men to a car. They were given a handful of cooked potatoes, 500 grams of bread, 50 grams of sausage, and 25 grams of margarine. The meager rations were all the prisoners received for the next 3 weeks, unless they were fortunate enough to catch food from the few German civilians who passed it to them as they crossed under the bridges. Along the way, the train cars were frequently opened, and the SS fired indiscriminately at their occupants. By the time it arrived in Dachau on April 27th, the train's occupants were all dead or dying. 2 days later, when Dachau's American Liberators finally opened its cars, Colonel Downard found one lone Polish survivor, miraculously still alive, sandwiched between the corpses. When Dorris arrived at Dachau's gates, he found them to be guarded by vicious German shepherds, not by German SS soldiers. "We did not have to fight our way into the camp, since the guards at this gate had fled. Large German shepherds, chained to each side of the gate, were barking and lunging furiously at us. We had to shoot the dogs." Inside the camp, Dorris recalled rows of naked, starved bodies piled on top of each other, waiting to be carried to the crematorium. Dorris was struck by how accustomed the prisoners seemed to be to the bodies, ignoring them as they walked by. Dorris was ordered to stand guard and to keep the inmates in the camp so that they could be examined and treated by the American doctors who would arrive later. "My post was between the high outside concrete wall with its guard towers and an inside wire fence, which had been previously electrified. I had to walk around the body of a man who had been so savagely beaten that his left eye laid out on his cheek." The inmates that had been at Dachau the longest suffered from starvation and seemed more like skeletons than men. Others, who had only recently arrived, appeared in better condition. But Dorris noticed all seemed to have a haunted, blank expression about them, as if they did not fully comprehend that they had just been liberated. Suddenly, while Dorris stood guard, he noticed an inmate pick up something that had been on the ground. He started to run, as 3 or 4 other inmates chased him. They knocked him down, and they pried open his hand, only to find nothing there. "The whole scene was so horribly depressing, I could only think that this must be what hell is like. I started praying and asking God to please get me out of there," Dorris recalled. Shortly after his prayer, a concentration camp prisoner walked to the fence where Dorris was standing guard and asked him for a cigarette. "I had 2 or 3 packs, but not near enough for all the people watching. Fearing to start a riot if I didn't give each of them a cigarette, I told him no. He asked me to wait, and he ran off behind the barracks. I waited a while, and then started walking to my post again. In a few minutes he returned and handed me a small rusty can through the fence. Inside the can was a small cigarette butt about 1 inch long. He then said, 'This is in thanks for liberating us.' Realizing this was probably the greatest treasure he owned, I almost cried. Years later, in thinking about this, I felt that had been God's answer to my prayer, to show me His goodness could be found even there." Dorris was assigned to spend the night in the same barracks where the Nazi prison guards had slept. For Dorris, it was a sleepless night, as he tossed and turned and wondered, what kind of man slept here last night? Did his conscience bother him about what went on here? The following day, April 30th, Dorris was loaded onto a tank that was sent to Munich, where he found little resistance and was greeted by German civilians who gave the Americans flowers and bottles of wine. While on patrol in Munich, Dorris heard a woman screaming from the 2nd floor of a nearby building. With Dachau still fresh in his mind, Dorris knew he had to act. As the screams got louder, Dorris ran up the office building steps, 2 at a time. The screams were coming from an old woman who appeared to be in her 70s, who stood in the doorway of what appeared to be a dentist's waiting office. I ran through the door, and to my right I saw a large glass case filled with dental instruments. To my surprise, I saw one of my platoon buddies smash the glass case with his rifle, spraying shards across the room. Behind the dentist's chair, Dorris spotted two of his platoon buddies striking the old dentist with their rifles as he cowered helplessly in the corner. They yelled at him as they hit him. I couldn't believe this was happening, having seen what the German guards had done in Dachau just the day before, Dorris explained. Dorris was only a private first class, and his buddies were sergeants, but Dorris knew he had to stop the senseless violence. I shouted as angrily and as loud as I could, "Stop it, or I'll shoot the next one who hits the old man!" The room grew immediately quiet. The sergeants angrily turned towards Dorris, measuring him up, determining whether he would really shoot to protect the old man. Finally, the tension was broken as Sergeant Irwin said, "Let's go, men." Dorris said a silent prayer, thanking God that his bluff had worked. The old dentist and his wife hugged each other as the sergeants exited the office and went down the stairs. The old German couple looked at Dorris with love and affection. Dorris kissed the old woman and left the office. The next day, Dorris asked one of the men why the sergeants had beaten the old dentist. He said Sergeant Irwin thought that the dentists filled teeth with gold, and he wanted the supply that office must hold. Jim Dorris and his wife Charlotte returned to Dachau to attend the 50th anniversary of its liberation in 1995. The World War II veterans who returned for the liberation anniversary were joined by about 2,000 ex-prisoners of Dachau. They were treated like royalty by the mayors of Dachau, Munich, and the Prime Minister of Bavaria. On April 30th, 50 years after Dorris had spent his restless night's sleep in a bunk that had belonged to a Nazi prison guard, Dorris attended Mass in the camp. Jewish and Protestant services were conducted simultaneously elsewhere in the camp. Gratified that religious services could now be conducted in a place where no religion would have been tolerated before, Dorris listened intently. Friedrich Cardinal Vetter, in his sermon, said that the course of 12 years, 200,000 prisoners from almost 40 nations had gone through this camp. More than 30,000 died of exhaustion, disease, and hunger. They froze to death, were given lethal drugs, were shot, hanged, or beaten to death. 2,800 Catholic priests were imprisoned there, and 1,106 died. But Cardinal Vetter also recalled the courageous local people who performed small acts of kindness to mitigate the suffering of the concentration camp prisoners. At the cost of their own freedom, they secretly smuggled letters and groceries, medicines, and clothes into the camp. They therefore alleviated material and spiritual misery and showed the prisoners that you are not alone. We are with you. Dee Eberhart of Ellensburg, Washington, was the first scout in a rifle squad assigned to the 42nd Rainbow Division, attached to the 7th Army that liberated Dachau concentration camp. Prior to liberating Dachau, the 7th Army attacked through the hot mountains in Siegfried Line, West Wall, in mid-March, crossed the Rhine at Worms, and our division captured Würzburg, Schweinfurt, Fürth, and Donauwörth, Eberhart wrote. The frantic pace of the division's sweep to the south was aimed at denying the German army and the SS their ability to fortify defenses in the Alpine Redoubt, the mountainous region of southern Germany and western Austria. Allied intelligence had been deceived by the Nazis into believing Hitler planned to move his base of operations to the Alpine Redoubt, whose natural fortifications would enable him to carry out a prolonged resistance to the invading Allied armies. The Nazi Rus was never seriously put into action and succeeded in diverting Allied troops from Berlin, which ultimately fell to Soviet forces on May 2, 1945. On April 29, 1945, the Rainbow Division entered Dachau. Eberhart wrote, "No one was prepared for the sight of the piled-up dead and the terrible condition of the prisoners." Eberhart's company did not enter the prisoners' compound. The closest they came was approximately 1,000 yards. His assistant squad leader, Jack Perry, and a few other men went forward to the moat and observed, "Prisoners beating up the guards, actually killing them." By late afternoon, Eberhart's rifle squad had entered the town of Dachau, where they encountered former prisoners in twos and threes, wearing their striped blue-gray garb in various degrees of starvation. The squad spent the night in Dachau before moving on to Munich the following day. On the way, they passed the death train packed with bodies, dead of exposure, disease, starvation, and SS bullets. There is only one survivor, rescued on April 29th by Lieutenant Colonel Downard, CO 2nd Battalion, 22nd Regiment, and a tank destroyer officer. While the Rainbow Division did not arrive in time for the inhabitants of the death train, an estimated 32,000 prisoners were found still alive inside the camp. Eberhart recalled the chaotic days that followed Dachau's liberation as the army struggled to take care of them. Lieutenant Colonel Minky Felenz, CO 1st Battalion, 222nd, he was placed in charge. He established liaison with the International Committee. They agreed to keep the prisoners confined so they could be helped and typhus checked. The SS commissary supplied food at first, and an expanded hospital was manned by a medical unit which soon arrived. Unfortunately, individual soldiers tried to help by giving the victims K and C rations. In some cases, this caused deaths because they had been deprived of solid food for so long. As they did at Buchenwald, liberated only weeks before, the Allied Army Command forced local German civilians to tour the camp. General Eisenhower wanted to establish as many witnesses as possible. Thus the stacked bodies were left exposed, Eberhart wrote. It was important for the local residents to bear witness to the camp's atrocities, since so many claimed they knew nothing about what went on inside the concentration camp. Curious local residents had been warned from the beginning that if they attempted to look over the walls surrounding Dachau, that they would be arrested and be given the opportunity of studying the camp from inside for longer than just one night, according to a warning from the Special Commissioner of the Supreme SA Command, the Nazi paramilitary Storm Detachment Friedrichs, in June 1933. Still, Eberhart believed the local residents were well aware of what went on inside the camp, even the old woman whose home he spent the night in nearby the camp. She denied all knowledge of the camp. I did not believe her. For example, in the house next door, there was a tattooed human skin lampshade, but the people who lived there, civilian or SS, were long gone. After the war, Rainbow Division Liberators made a pledge to the victims of Dachau to keep the memory of the atrocities that the Nazis committed there alive, and to counter the lies of the Holocaust deniers. The Rainbow Memorial Foundation worked together with the International Dachau Committee to preserve the camp's history, erecting a 7th Army Liberators plaque on the old Dachau main gate with its Arbeit macht frei, work sets you free, inscription. The Rainbow Division was also active in many Holocaust remembrances both in Europe and in the United States. When the Rainbow Division dedicated a Dachau monument in Amsterdam, Netherlands, on December 1, 1996, Eberhart spoke for the men of his Rainbow Division who could not be there. It is one thing to be brave with a rifle in your hands. It is quite another to confront an armed enemy with only your bare hands. There's no group of people I admire more than you survivors and your dead comrades. You maintained your courage and your faith, and all of you paid a terrible price. It is you who are the true moral guardians of freedom and civilization. All of my Rainbow Division friends who were at Dachau on the day of liberation wish that we had done more and done it much, much sooner. Eberhart also recited Dachau Waits, a poem he had written for the dedication and for the Sam Dan book about the Rainbow Division's liberation of Dachau, the 29th day of April, 1945. Dachau Waits. Dachau, restless and uneasy, waits. One day, past freedom, snow softly fell, but could not hide the horror there. The chill remains throughout all seasons, felt by those who live within the shadow, who wish that it would go away. Survivors still return on pilgrimage. When they are gone, who then will keep the memory? Who then will keep eternal vigil? Dachau, restless and uneasy, waits. In his letter dated March 29, 1996, Eberhart eloquently wrote of what he had learned from Dachau and from the war itself. Only a thin veneer of civilization, probably not original, covers the seething hatreds and potential for brutality beneath. As we know from the events of this century alone, it doesn't take much to loose the demons. Even though I have long since given up on the perfect ability of mankind, which may have begun when my much-admired platoon sergeant calmly picked off a wounded enemy soldier in the midst of an enemy attack in a snowfield while making a crude army joke. It turned out that he was SS, but none of us knew it at the time. The next day, I helped save one of them who had been shot. I fed him, I gave him a smoke, and I had the aid man bandage him. But this was also before I knew that he too was SS, that the SS had mowed down our captured men at Malmedy, and of course, before Dachau. It has subsequently been written that the concentration camp guards were just ordinary men, and so they were in their own and German society's eyes. What would be curious is if there turned out to be remorse felt by these ordinary men after the fact. I do not believe that there is any remorse in killing enemy soldiers. Why then, as they see it, should there be any remorse in killing the falsely created enemy of the state? Jews, Slavs, Gypsies, etc. Because of the danger of the abyss opening, it seems to me that all of us need to be on guard against hatred and vilification of others. We need to do good deeds, and especially do what you're doing. Teach true history and important values to the young. As the years went by, America's Holocaust liberators were particularly incensed by the Holocaust deniers. Their lies not only denigrated the sacrifices of the millions of innocents who perished in the camps, they were also an affront to the courage of the soldiers who liberated the concentration camps and the ones who sacrificed their lives to defeat the Axis powers. For some of America's Holocaust liberators, such as Richard J. Tisch of Chatham, New Jersey, who served with Dee Eberhart in the Rainbow Division, their response to deniers was to become active in Holocaust memorial associations in the United States. Tisch served as an associate of the Center of Holocaust Study at Drew University in Madison, New Jersey. He recalled that the 32,000 prisoners liberated at Dachau suffered so much from disease and malnutrition that another 4,000 died in the weeks following the camp's liberation. As with so many veterans of World War II, Tisch did not regard himself as a hero, but wrote, I do not know of many who were. Having seen the horrors of Dachau firsthand, Tisch did regard himself and all units that fought in Europe and the soldiers that died in the Normandy landings as liberators. David L. Israel of Medford, Oregon, was not at Dachau for its liberation on April 29, 1945, but he arrived shortly thereafter with a 5-man intelligence team. Despite having spent nearly a year in that God-forsaken place, when Israel returned to Dachau for the 50th anniversary of its liberation, he was amazed to find that I remembered absolutely nothing. My mind had been purged of all memory. Israel could not identify the streets around the compound, nor the one that he lived on, less than a mile away from Dachau. Although Israel's mind successfully purged itself of the terrible memories of the camp, Israel spent 18 years revisiting the terrible history of Dachau as he interviewed liberators of the camp for his book, The Day the Thunderbird Cried, Untold Stories of World War II. In a June 4th, 1997 letter to this author, Israel mentioned that he had witnessed dozens of veterans who claimed to have liberated Dachau, but were often nowhere near the camp. Of the 3,500,000 GIs in the European theater of operations at the war's end, almost all of them claimed to have liberated Dachau, Israel confided. When it was liberated on April 29, 1945, Dachau and its many subcamps, totaling as many as 240 subcamps at their peak, still housed some 60,000 prisoners. Israel concluded the existence of so many Dachau subcamps was why so many GIs swore they had liberated Dachau. There were plenty of camps to go around. According to Israel, John D. Grohl, lead scout for I Company of the 157th Infantry Regiment, led the first unit to enter the camp. They came upon 39 railroad cars of various descriptions, all filled with bodies of men, women, and children. Some had gotten out of the train. They had been attacked by dogs and were shot. There were white flags flying from the guard towers, but there were shots being fired at the Americans and also at the prisoners in the compound. When the Americans arrived at the main camp of Dachau, they found approximately 32,000 prisoners still alive, but only barely. Israel recalled, "They died at the rate of 200 to 400 per day after being liberated. Starvation and disease." Other veterans put the death rate of prisoners post-liberation much lower. Among Dachau's survivors was one American OSS officer, Lieutenant Rene Girard of Cicero, Illinois, along with several British soldiers. Most of the townspeople claimed total ignorance about Dachau's true purpose. Israel rejected this as an impossibility for several reasons. Many of them worked in the camp, and the prisoners worked in many of the town industries and were marched through the town on a daily basis. And since the trains rode through the town daily with their human cargo, not to mention that the guards drank in the town bars and boasted about their heroic work in the camp, the SS also conducted many businesses in the camp, and they sold their goods to townspeople in Dachau and Munich. As for the hundreds of dead bodies found at Dachau, including those who perished in the 39-car abandoned death train near the camp, the townspeople were forced by the Americans to dig them mass graves. They buried the death train's unfortunate passengers on a hill alongside an Italian monument just outside of town. In an ironic twist of fate, after the war, some 15,000 SS officers were imprisoned at Dachau, the very same camp where they had tortured so many innocent civilians. Israel was assigned to a 5-man intelligence team whose mission was to interrogate the SS officers at the camp. Even 50 years later, Israel didn't want to talk much about his interrogation of the SS, but he did admit in an interview in the Davis Enterprise newspaper that he harbored brutal thoughts towards them. While many Nazi guards were killed during the liberation of Dachau, either by American soldiers or by the prisoners themselves, 40 were captured and put on trial prior to the Nuremberg war trials. 36 were sentenced to death. Most of the SS who were interned at Dachau were later released. In a June 4, 1997 letter, Israel recalled that a neighbor had recently asked him, "When are you people going to forget about the Holocaust?" after a showing of Schindler's List on television. I slowly took another sip of coffee before answering, and then I changed the subject. For 4 months I have agonized over how I was going to answer that son of a bitch, since I wanted my answer to be quite clear and unmistakable. Having come from Brooklyn, New York, 70 years ago, and having been around the block several times, I knew immediately with which type of denier I was dealing with. At this age, one does not respond with a pop on the snoot, but I wanted my answer to hit the bastard a shot that he would remember for a long time. Your letter gave me the answer I was looking for, and on the 28th of this month, when I am scheduled to deliver a speech to the retirement community where we live, I will give my answer in public, thanks to you. In the weeks immediately following Dachau's liberation, Edward S. Weiss of Gaithersburg, Maryland, had a particularly grim task. One of my duties was getting bodies to the crematorium before Army graves registration people took over, Weiss explained. Sadly, the dead kept increasing in numbers, especially in the weeks immediately following Dachau's liberation. Unfortunately, deaths at the rate of 20 to 30 men per day occurred during the first few weeks I was there. By the late summer, they were down to 1 or 2 per day. Dachau's liberated inmates were still restricted to the camp to avoid spread of typhus, and they organized themselves into national or ethnic groups. One of these groups were Polish Jews, perhaps a few hundred. Weiss was astonished to find that the SS had stockpiled supplies that could have been used by German soldiers on the front within the camp, as well as stolen loot. The camp housed 2 major SS facilities, 1 a well-equipped hospital, and 2 a collection of warehouses with supplies for SS forces and the dependents. These warehouses stored loot from all over Europe and Russia, and included textiles, handware, glassware, leather and furs, dishes and tableware. The POWs were shocked to find that even as frontline troops, they could not get things that the SS had in abundance. After a while, Weiss began to look at some of the well-fed, well-dressed survivors a bit differently, wondering how they had survived while so many others had perished, and concluded that they must have done some terrible things in order to survive, but none of us know how we would have acted when the choice was to follow orders or die. So I learned not to judge and not to ask too many questions. Weiss wrote his parents back in Blissfield, Michigan, a V-mail on June 5, 1945, describing conditions post-liberation at Dachau. He shared the V-mail with the author. We are living in one of the modern houses just outside the walls of the concentration camp, which have been converted into a hospital. Most of the 40,000 prisoners have been released, and the 2,000 or 3,000 left are suffering chiefly from malnutrition. There are now 3 or 4 American hospital units operating in various sections of the camp. German doctors and nurses are coming in to replace the American personnel. When the exchange is complete, the American groups will leave, and Hospital Plant 1 will take over the administration of the camp. All is well. Love, Ed. Our song today was I Love You by Willy Rosen. Rosen was a German singer, pianist, and composer who fled to the Netherlands, but was eventually captured and sent to Westerbork concentration camp, where he wrote this song in 1943. He was later moved to Terezin camp in Czechoslovakia, where he died on April 28, 1944. If you like this podcast of Always Remember World War II through Veterans' Eyes, please leave us a review on whatever podcast network you use. Follow our podcasts and tell your friends. New episodes come out bi-weekly. You can find the companion book on Amazon.com. Also, please be sure to check our website out for many photographs of the veterans discussed in this and other episodes, as well as pictures of the liberation of Dachau concentration camp. To carry out his plan to murder Europe's Jews, Hitler constructed 42,400 concentration camps throughout Europe. Our next episode, Part 3 of the Liberators of the Holocaust, will continue to tell the stories of the liberators of some of the lesser-known concentration camps. Also, if for more information about Jim Dorris, we're going to be doing a special 2-part episode on the life of Jim Dorris called A Light in the Darkness of World War II with his son Steve later this fall. Until next time, thank you for remembering our World War II veterans.